Good evening and welcome. Thank you for coming on this very rainy day. We're going to make it worth your while, I promise. My name is Julia Seaman, and I am Director of Exhibitions and Chief Curator here at the Bard Graduate Center. Tonight's event is a Françoise and George Seltz lecture on 18th and 19th century decorative arts and culture. It is also our final Wednesday lecture of 2024. So although I know tonight will leave you wanting more, please don't come back next week. This evening's distinguished guest speaker is Mia Jackson, Curator of Decorative Arts at Waddesdon Manor in Buckinghamshire. For those of you who have not yet had the pleasure of visiting Waddesdon, it is a grand 19th century home, really a palace, built in the style of a Renaissance chateau and located about an hour outside of London. The original owner, builder, was Ferdinand de Rothschild, who was a passionate collector of French 18th century objects. And so Mia, in her role as Curator of Decorative Arts at Waddesdon, oversees one of the world's foremost collections of that material. Mia came to the position well prepared. She has an MA in 18th century French decorative arts from the Courtauld and a PhD from Queen Mary University of London, where her research focused on the famous furniture maker André Charles Boulle, and in particular on his own collection of prints and drawings. Early in her career, Mia continued to study works on paper, spending 4 years in the Department of Prints and Drawings at the British Museum. She returned to the field of decorative arts in 2017 when she joined the staff at Waddesdon. There, she has curated a number of fascinating and diverse shows, some rooted in the history and collections of Waddesdon, and others not at all in any way. I'm thinking recently of a wedding cake sculpture commissioned for the lawn. Yes, relevant. Um, most recently, Mia curated an exhibition called Flights of Fancy, Birds at Waddesdon, which closed just a few weeks ago. The exhibition centered on the work of the 18th century painter Louis Denis Armand, whose specialty was painting birds on porcelain at the Sèvres Manufactory. I know this project was close to Mia's heart. She is, after all, co-chair of the French Porcelain Society. And so I am particularly delighted that she agreed to fly to New York to share Armand and his birds with us here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Mia.
I'm waiting for the door to do its strange noise that Andrew has warned me about. Are you ready? So, thank you very much to Julia and to Andrew for inviting me to speak about the other Sèvres exhibition of 2024. I'm delighted to be here in New York, and I only wish I was able to visit the Bards exhibition, and I think I shall have to come back. Whereas the sculpture show is a huge topic covering the Sèvres factory and its production from its foundation to the present day, Flights of Fancy honed in on one painter and his career, providing the first ever survey of his work. You will see just how lucky we are to have an exceptional amount of material on this rather extraordinary character. I think this opening slide gives you a flavour of what I mean by a flight of fancy. Here is Waddesdon Manor, where I work and where the exhibition took place. And as Julia's already said, it's a fantastic neo-Renaissance French chateau on the top of a hill in Buckinghamshire that was built by Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild in the 1870s. I first started considering an exhibition that focused on the work of Louis Denis Armand in 2022, when I put 4 vases by him in a case, along with Madame de Pompadour's snuff box, which he also painted, for an exhibition which celebrated Alice de Rothschild as a collector. And Alice was the sister of Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild, and this exhibition was to try and put her collecting back on the map. She was evidently a fan of Ledoux, or the present painter, as he was known in her lifetime, acquiring no fewer than 7 vases by him, as well as the fantastic Madame de Pompadour box. She also inherited a further 3 of his vases, from her brother Ferdinand. Added to that, we also have at Waddesdon the 1767 Razumovsky service, of which 10 pieces were painted by Armand, as well as another pair of ice cream coolers from around 1769. So I thought I could put all of these objects in a room along with a certain suite of drawings I'd heard about, and that would be pretty impressive. So that would be about 23 pieces of Sèvres and about 30 drawings. However, the idea had wings. First of a few bird puns. Not only does Waddesdon have a Rococo-style aviary that you can see on the top left, with endangered residents who participate in an international breeding programme, it turned out that many other members of the Rothschild family, as well as Ferdinand and Alice, had been interested in keeping exotic birds too. So we added an archival exhibition about Rothschild aviaries to the programme, and then we remembered a gifted paper artist, Andy Singleton, who had made us a giant peacock once for Christmas, and we thought it might be fun to put the Razumovsky service on the dining room table, accompanied by paper representations of the birds depicted on the service flying out of some 18th century bird cages, which I conveniently found in the basement. And it kept growing. To our 23 pieces by Armand were added at least 77 more. Private collectors offered incredible loans, supplementing our pieces, which, of course, though impressive, represented only a fraction of Armand's output in the 1750s and 60s. The museum at Sèvres lent 5 pieces, crucially the earliest and the latest that we know by Armand. We needed to rethink the exhibition to take account of the number of loans, my colleagues in the stewards team taking all of the porcelain out of the room where the Razumovsky service is normally displayed to make room for lots and lots more porcelain with birds on it. I went to Paris and I fetched the drawings from their wonderful owners, Bernard Duguesco and Didier Cromazin, and a paper conservator spent weeks mounting and framing them all in Waddesdon's attics. The gardeners got inspired. We had carpet bedding, which you can see on the bottom row, second picture along, which was inspired by a drawing by Armand of 2 golden orioles, placed against a vermiculate background, and 2 giant 3D planted birds. You can see one of them arriving on a tractor next to the carpet bedding, with more accoutrements to make visual reference to Armand, bigger crests, grass collars, and some of them sprouted coloured feather headdresses. It turned into a site-wide event, linking nearly all departments at Waddesdon. And this is a view of the cases in the exhibition that covered 1749 to 1756. Normally, as I mentioned, the cases show the Razumovsky service, and the upper level is occupied by the many plates that are part of the service. But we didn't want to spend time and money borrowing objects and then put the objects where people couldn't see them. So instead we put giant blow-ups of birds from pieces in each case, which was a great way of encouraging visitors to look closely at the porcelain. The suite of drawings that I mentioned were discovered in Paris in 1990. They'd been purchased by 3 generalist antique dealers who realised, thanks to the extensive annotations on the drawings, that they had something to do with Vincennes Sèvres, and offered them for sale to the present-day archives, who unfortunately were unable to purchase them. Our dear friend Tamara Préau had the presence of mind to ring Bernard Duguesco and tell him about them. He and Didier had been researching the at that point unidentified painter of characterful and colourful birds, who signed with a crescent and particularly loopy interlaced L's. Concurrently, David Peters and Ginetta Zelliker, both Sèvres scholars, had been doing their own research in the archives, and all roads were starting to lead to an identification of the crescent painter with Louis Denis Armand. Whilst most 18th century artisans drew, their drawings do not often survive. This is partly to do with what was gathered and valued by collectors, but also how the drawings were used. A drawing of a bird used as a reference for several porcelain objects was more likely to be spoilt and thrown away than a framed portrait, for example. The extensive autobiographical notes that are on the reverse of many of these drawings and include information such as recollections from Armand's childhood, the date he joined the Vincennes manufactory, his life at work, his failing health in later life, and information about the French Revolution. The drawings and their annotations may not always have been made at the same time, but the annotations seem to date mainly from the 1780s and 90s. The drawings were the final piece of proof that was needed. Not only was there a cipher amongst them, spelling out Armand's name, but the handwriting matched the handwriting on this exceptionally rare palette cup, the top of which you can see top left. The crescent also made an appearance on the back of one of the drawings, which you can see top right, when Armand ran out of space when writing the rough version of a letter and used the crescent in the way that we might use an asterisk to mean continue reading here. To those 30 drawings was added another drawing which Bernard had acquired from an English auction house where it had mysteriously turned up in the sale of an interior designer's collection. It has particularly charming annotations. You can see that it is water damaged, and Armand writes in the bottom right-hand corner that he left it by an open window and the rain came in. Armand has written a note next to the bird under the tree saying, "But don't worry about this poor little devil, he has shelter." We also borrowed these 3 drawings from a private collector in Paris who'd found them at one of the Parisian flea markets. I particularly like the little bird's bottoms on the left, and the inscription that says, "They, the birds, can hear their enemies above their heads. They know which trees to choose to hide themselves the best they can." I wanted to show you some of the objects in the exhibition, starting with this palette bowl, which was a must for me. These palette bowls are really rare, and I think only 2 18th century ones are known from Vincennes. It was acquired by Adrian Sassoon in the 1980s, before Armand and the crescent painter had become identified as synonymous, and it's an object that evokes the everyday in the Vincennes manufactory, as well as being something which, like the drawings, would have been close to Louis Denis, so there's something kind of talismanic about it. It had a case all to itself in the exhibition and proudly sat in front of a mirror within an explanatory panel about the Vincennes manufactory and its history. Because porcelain colours look so different raw to what they look like fired, every Sèvres painter must have had a palette cup, plate or plaque that showed what the colours looked like once fired. The numbers next to each tiny square would refer to the numbers on the paper packets that the colours in powder form would have come in. It's an object that makes people who think they don't like porcelain, but we all know that people who don't like porcelain are just lying to themselves, look closely, and it captivates them. There's something immediately relatable about it. We also borrowed from Sèvres a magnificent early tureen. There was another round one in the show that sold very recently here in New York at Christie's in the big Rothschild sale. But this tureen is extremely special because Viviane Meski, who is one of the curators at the Sèvres Museum, recently discovered Armand's signature within one of the scenes, Armand invenit et pinxit. This is an incredible discovery. Firstly, that no one had noticed it before. The tureen's been sitting in the Sèvres Museum since the middle of last century. But in all of our defences, I will say that the signature is absolutely minuscule. But also, apart from palette cups, where else do we see Vincennes porcelain signed in any other way than a painter's mark? In 1751, Hendrik van Holst, who was artistic director at that moment at the manufactory, wrote to the director about cups decorated with birds. "They cannot fail to succeed," he said. If we make them a bit simpler, I think they'll be even more successful. I would also like to vary the distribution of the birds in order not to seem as though we're slavishly repeating ourselves. Some birds in the air, some on the ground, would give a certain play to the composition, which is always good. Brother Armand is easy to teach, and Monsieur Bachelier could do him a lot of good by guiding him a little with the layout and teaching him the principles that will lead him to paint them tastefully. And I think that the so on the left shows pre-Bachelier Armand birds, and the so on the right shows post-Bachelier birds. Both depict fantasy birds, which is true of most of Armand's birds on porcelain, but the ones on the right seem to have actual bird anatomy. This urine basin were a diplomatic gift from Madame de Pompadour to Clemens August of Bavaria, Elector of Cologne, in 1756. The two pieces are now in two different collections, and this was the first time that they had been together since at least the 19th century. Rather than Armand's usual grouping of maybe 2 or 3 birds in conversation, the ewer exceptionally has 6 birds on it in the reserve, and the basin is elaborately decorated both inside and out. The basin was badly broken at some point, probably in the 19th century, and thus discarded by its then owner, but it surfaced not very long ago on the Parisian art market and has since been very well restored. And these were 2 of the vases that were acquired by Alice de Rothschild, both of which are one of a pair. These were the vases that sparked the idea for the show, as they're decorated with the same birds in very similar scenes and composition. The vase on the left was painted in 1755 and the one on the right in 1763. I was really fascinated by putting them together and seeing how Armand's style evolved over those years, and that became one of the key tenets of the show, to demonstrate the evolution of Armand's work and to have as many pieces as possible next to each other to compare. And you can see sort of various things like the way he paints leaves completely changes in those years, and his parrots become slightly more realistic. This plate, also from 1756, is just so beautiful, and it's marked for a different painter, Thévenet, who painted the flowers, but the birds are unmistakably Armand's. It was the first time that these two pieces had been together um, since they were both owned by Madame de Pompadour, and they were both sold at a sale after her death in 1764. And you can see that the cockatoo is the same on both pieces, and it's after Jean-Jacques Bachelier, who I mentioned earlier, who was a particularly gifted painter of birds. And excitingly, thanks to the research files of Monsieur Dragesco, I found out relatively recently that the parrot is after painter Christophe Huet, from a painting that he did for Madame de Pompadour in 1755, and which sold at auction in Paris without that crucial bit of information being mentioned. The painting was one of a pair showing lots of exotic birds, presumably all inhabitants of Madame de Pompadour's aviaries, and crucially, this parrot inset is exactly the same. And I got very excited about this parrot, and I've since found out through extensive research (brackets scrolling Instagram) that the African greys with extra red feathers are said to have the red factor, and that it can occur naturally as a spontaneous genetic mutation, but then it can also be selectively bred, so you can keep breeding your African greys that have got a few extra red feathers more and more and more until the Holy Grail is achieved, which is a completely red African grey. The vase on the left is the cover star of the Waddesdon Sèvres catalogue, written by Sven Derrickson in the 1970s, and it was joined in the exhibition by its cousin, on the right, which evidently lost its base at some point, but was fascinating to see side by side with the vase from Waddesdon. It has the same composition, but the birds have got different features, different feet, different beaks, different colouring. And it was sold in 2008, and it isn't the first instance of Armand adapting a composition, and we only have to assume that there's a drawing that relates to these birds somewhere out there, or at least there was, which acted as a model. And these three cups and saucers were shown together on one shelf in the exhibition, and I thought they made such a great trio. They're very close to each other in date. The one on the bottom left has an incredible ground which seems to be designed to imitate hard stones. The wildness of the bird on the cup, with his huge eye feathers, appealed immediately to visitors. I had objects from three lenders from the United States who were kind enough to transport the objects to me, an act of kindness that so many people appreciated because the objects they lent were so fantastic. The birds on the cup on the top right are framed by peacock feather gilding, the delicacy and accuracy of which is unbelievable. And the glorious pink and green cup was once part of a déjeuner owned by Louis XV. When the factory underwent a restructure and painters had their salaries reduced in 1760, Armand did not. The archives at the factory attest to the esteem in which he was held. As Le Sieur Armand is so precious and unique in his genre, we are only able to keep him at the factory by promising him that he will have no reduction in his annual pay of 2,400 livres. He'd been earning 100 livres a month from 1753, and he received an annual bonus of 1,200 livres. These green and blue vases in Waddesdon's collection were originally part of a garniture with the ship vase that is now in the Wallace collection, and are one of two ship vase, ear vase garnitures, the other one of which is right here in New York at the Frick collection. This is one of the drawings and its adaptation on the vase à oreilles that you've just seen. This group of three birds seems to be a favourite of Armand's. One bird is being squawked at by another, who by the time he's depicted on porcelain has an even more threatening stance, with his wings open as if in exasperation. The bird being berated in the drawing looks hurt, even bemused by whatever accusations are being levelled at him, but on the porcelain he's moved higher in the composition, and his stance has become more defensive, and is given greater presence by the addition of a magnificent crest. The bird turning his head away wants nothing to do with this uncouth pair and their public fight, and the bird pecking the ground in the drawing appears elsewhere on this tray. And I love this tray because it acts as a porcelain plaque to be hung on the wall, even though it may have had a practical function as a tray, or may have been designed to be mounted into the top of a table, as trays of this shape sometimes were. By 1761, the manufactory was technically capable of producing large enough, flat enough plaques that were used as paintings that, of course, did not fade. They're usually decorated with figural scenes and often adaptations of oil paintings, although sometimes original compositions. We don't know if Armand ever painted any plaques that were designed to be framed, but I think if he did, then I think we know of several potential buyers for them. He evidently observed parrots from life. He definitely knew a parrot, and I think he knew a blue and gold macaw, and I'm not sure whose blue and gold macaw he knew personally, but I'm pretty sure that he knew a parrot. And the one in the middle is almost the reverse of the one in the drawing on the branch, and also appears on a plate from 1753 to 4 belonging to Adrian Sassoon. And then the green and red parrots are after George Edwards, who wrote an 18th century encyclopedia of birds, and which the Sèvres painters copied on a number of dinner services, beginning with a service for the Duke of Richmond, and also using the same source material for Waddesdon's Razumovsky service. So throughout the exhibition, I tried to get as wide a representation of shapes, decoration, and date as possible, with the caveat, of course, being that Armand was most active in the 50s and 60s, and that at a certain point, he was most often called upon to paint vases or the larger pieces in a service. This pair of ice cream coolers from the Duke of Parma service attest not only to his amazing imagination, the pink bird wearing a blue toupee is one of the best, but also to the realism of the French rural landscapes that they find themselves in. This period in particular, when quite frankly wacky birds are having their arguments in Fontenay-sous-Bois or with the Moulin de Charenton in the background, are some of the most surreal in Sèvres porcelain. Not very much is known about this Uran basin. I haven't been able to find it in any Sèvres archival material, but this marks the moment where the birds start growing, filling up more of the cartouche and really being foregrounded. The bizarre chap in the pink fur-collared jacket is probably a combination of a king vulture and Armand's drug-fueled imagination, and his interlocutor on the right is a beautifully exaggerated starling. And this mortier, which was what you mashed up the fruit to go in the punch, is from one of two services, which are difficult to distinguish, either made for Gustav III of Sweden or his brother Frederick Adolf, Duke of Östergötland. The detail with which Armand has painted these rather fat little birds is really incredible. And this is a punch bowl, not the one that goes with the mortier, but it was definitely one of the highlights for me in the exhibition because its scale and the three scenes. I particularly love the bird wading and drinking from the river, were just unbelievably good. So one of the last great Bleu Celeste dessert services produced at Sèvres was made for Louis-René Edouard, Prince de Rouen, and bears his cipher of LPR in two colours of gold. The service is now in many different collections, with lots of pieces from the service here in the Met in New York. The punch bowl is by Armand and is particularly great. And there's also an important group in Strasbourg, but the two wine coolers on the top of the slide, it turns out belonged to Ferdinand de Rothschild, who built Waddesdon, who left them to his cousin Leopold in his will. And in his will, it reads, "I give to my cousin Leopold de Rothschild the following articles at 143 Piccadilly," you know, a Rubens, a Hobbema, etc. But crucially, my pair of turquoise Sèvres with the initials in gold PR from the Rohan service at Waddesdon. So it's very interesting because he thought that the Razumovsky service was the Rohan service, but by a process of elimination of the provenance of all of the different Soa Boutet, I realised that it's the ones on the top that must have originally been at Waddesdon, and so it was the first time they came back. And then this cup and saucer must have been a special commission for some person who wanted perhaps a portrait of their little doggies. And Armand was very good at dogs as well as birds, and this cup and saucer made it into the bird show by dint of the fact that some of the dogs are chasing birds. So at this point in Armand's career, he was swapping between the hard and soft-paced ateliers. So in 1768, kaolin was discovered on French soil, and well, you know, the French, they were like, we're not using anybody else's kaolin. So once they finally found some outside Limoges, they were like, okay, we can make hard paste porcelain now. And Armand was going backwards and forwards between the soft and hard paste ateliers. And this fabulous écuelle and platter was lent by Michel beanie. Hi, Michelle. And shows Armand's adaptation to the newish material, outlining in gilding, with the feathers highlighted in gilding. And yeah, so in 73 to 4, he was in the hard paste atelier. In 75 to 6, he was back in the hard paste, and then backwards and forwards between hard and soft paste. And this cup and saucer, I particularly like the bird's hat on the cup, was made in 1777 when he was in the hard paste atelier, but by 79 he was back in soft paste. But by 1780 he was only listed as doing piecework and not receiving an annual salary. So why did he go from one of the painters with the highest salaries to painting individual pieces? A clue can be found in a series of letters in the Sèvres archives, which I was delighted to discover. So until the death of the factory's director, Jacques-René Boileau, in 1772, it would appear that Armand could do no wrong. He was paid 100 livres per month, which was already pretty good, but then he received an additional 100 livres per month every month as a bonus. By 1775, his production was slowing down, so much so that it became a problem. In the early 1780s, there's a series of letters between the Comte d'Ingevilliers, director of buildings and manufactories, Jean-Étienne de Montouclat, his secretary, and Antoine Régnier, who was director of the manufactory, in response to a memoir that was written by Armand. We don't have the memoir, though I live in hope of finding it, though we can guess at its contents by the flavour of the responses. One letter describes Armand as lazy, but an excellent worker. He wants to be paid, says the letter, for doing nothing, pretending that the consideration that Monsieur Boileau had for him should excuse everything. He was permitted, continues said letter, to do nothing and say nothing. He was housed, 1,200 livres per year and 1,200 livres in bonuses, and all of this was taken away to put him on piecework. Every now and again, continues the first letter, he paints some pieces that are exceptionally highly finished. However, the letter continues, if, as he says, he has been of great use to the manufactory, and if, as he says, he is infirm, as he claims to be, it seems only fair that he should be given something to live on. After all, the vicissitudes of age come to us all, but only the director can confirm this. Armand was only 59, and a man of that age should be capable of sedentary work. Everything depends, continues the letter, on knowing whether or not he is infirm, as he claims. To be added to this, there just wasn't the money for those kinds of bonuses anymore, so a solution was proposed whereby he should be paid when he was able to work and paid per piece, but at an advantageous rate. However, by the time this proposal reached the director of the manufactory, it fell on fairly deaf ears. This was probably due to the director letting Montouclat know, and I paraphrase here, there's nothing wrong with him. Boileau allowed him to get away with doing nothing. You know the reasons, he says, without telling us the reasons. Régnier adds that it's entirely Armand's fault if he hardly earns anything, since he's continually off fishing or walking, and even recently Régnier bumped into him pounding the streets of Paris, and furthermore, far from Armand being justified in complaining that his work was underappreciated, Régnier had recently given him extra praise, and finally, he's not in the least bit infirm or uncomfortable, and if he wanted to work, he could quite easily earn 1,500 to 1,800 livres with no difficulty. Well, so he didn't get his advantageous rate after Régnier's rant, and it was even added to the next instalment in this series of letters that the favour granted to Armand of being able to work from home should be limited, since he might try to pass off lesser painters' work as his own, which would degenerate into a total abuse of the system. Poor Armand. So in 1780, he only did this déjeuner and 8 cups and saucers, which he was paid for by the piece. So these two vases are the latest pieces that we know by him, and his use of gilding here is simply remarkable. Although he specialised in birds, he occasionally painted other animals such as fish, turtles, porcupines, lions, and unicorns. Guess who that one was for? In the 1780s, in particular, he depicted monkeys in gilding on hard paste porcelain. And here we see two drawings of monkeys, one on a swing, and then there's also a drawing of some monkeys on a seesaw, which I forgot to put into this slide, and the monkey playing a violin on the left is also on one of the vases. He very rarely painted people, but they occasionally make an appearance in miniature within his very infrequent landscape scenes. His last appearance in the archives was in September 1788 when he painted one beau bleu vase with animals in golden colours, um, for which he was paid 480 livres. It must have been similar to the two vases that I've just shown, though it isn't either of these two vases. And we don't know, unfortunately, anything of his life between 1788 and his death in 1796. But I remain optimistic that more information about this remarkable man will at some point come to light. Thank you very much.
We have time for some questions. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand. Thank you. Do you have any idea how long a period of time it took for craftsmanship like this to be completed from start to finish?
So a one piece of porcelain, it would take a few months for a big piece of porcelain to start off as clay and end up as a marvelous punch bowl, because not only would it have to go in and out of the kiln several times, so it would be fired. It would first have a biscuit firing, and then it would have a glaze firing, and then it would have a ground color firing, and then it would have another firing and another firing and another firing and another firing, and finally a gilding firing. So yeah, in some cases a period of months, I would have thought.
I should have been more clear. I was actually asking about the decorative painting of surface. How long, and was it ever applied by more than one hand?
Yes. So some painters specialised in flowers. Other painters, such as Armand, specialised in birds. So you can sometimes find a piece of Sèvres that has got like the marks of 2 or even 3 painters, and then the mark of a different gilder, and it depends really. So Armand, on one of his drawings, mentions that he became very good at working well quickly, and when you start to look at a lot of pieces by the same painter, you can see in some cases where he is working well and quickly, and in other cases where he has really taken time. So, for example, the vase for Madame de Pompadour, he must have worked on that for weeks, and you had to do everything in stages. It was kind of painting by number, so you had to wait for one lot of colours to be fired to see how it turned out, to add the next lot of colours because they were fired at different temperatures.
Background was anatomically to be able to.
So, speaking about Armand in particular, his parents were craftsmen as well, so they painted fan leaves, and Armand started learning how to draw from his parents. And on the back of one of the drawings, he talks about, which was when he realizes that he's able to work well and quickly. He talks about wanting to go out and play when he was 8 years old, and so working faster. And his dad sort of realised this, and so just gave him more work. And his mother came to his defence and said, "Hey, let Louis Denis go out and play. He's only 8." At which point his father, and this is all recounted on the back of this drawing, turned to his mother and said, "Do we look like we're playing? Is this a game to you?"
Thanks for that fabulous talk. Time flew.
Oh.
There's a lot of hidden labor, and I know that you did a lot of study to distinguish between birds that actually existed and the fantastical. And I think you've come down to evaluate that most of them are kind of made up, with the exception of the parrot. Could you just comment a little bit on why, with knowing that there were aviaries, knowing that there were birds around, what the fantastical brought, and not just they were exciting, etc., but rather than studying and reproducing something that was known to exist, why create these totally insane birds?
Possibly, I maybe because he had a very overactive imagination. Again, going back to like notes on the drawings, one of my favorite comments that he makes is he said that I've just got too many ideas in my head and they're always bumping into each other. So I think like probably nowadays he'd be diagnosed as having ADHD. But he really sort of got carried away with his imagination, hence the kind of Flights of Fancy subtitle for the exhibition. I think it's I get the feeling, and this is just a feeling. I don't have any actual evidence to back this up, but I get the feeling that he rather resented when he was told to paint birds from other people's sources. So when the manufacturer took the decision to use George Edwards' birds as a source, like everyone else, you look at their birds and they're kind of like bang on. They're just after Edwards, and Armand's like, "I'm going to give him a blue crest." So yeah, I think it's a surfeit of imagination.
I'm an ornithologist from the Museum of Natural History down the street, so I can add
Hello.
something to your question. Even most of the parrots are entirely imaginary,
Yeah.
certainly the ones with crests, except for the sulfur-crested cockatoo
Yeah,
and
that
the blue and gold
sulfur-crested,
macaw.
yeah.
They're imaginary. Occasionally, in all of the things you've shown, there is a very iridescent blue cotinga from South America that is quite accurate.
Yeah.
But you should know that in the middle of the 18th century, even French soi-disant ornithologists were fabricating birds. There was an ornithologist named Le Vaillant who worked in South Africa, was the first to explore South Africa from the natural history point of view, and did a lot of plates of birds to which he added crests and other imaginary things and gave imaginary lifestyles to.
I like the sound of
pass,
this guy.
that passed, for decades because nobody else had been to South Africa and could correct him. So there was a fantastic streak. But also remember that from a lot of these tropical areas, we think of the birds being brilliantly colored. Overwhelmingly, most of them are rather brown and green because that's what fits into the rainforest. So a lot of the birds that were being brought back as specimens from what were then the frontiers of empire and expansion were in fact not that painterly compared to the things that he could invent.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And one of the things that thankfully I had a few ornithologists on hand, given that we have an aviary. And to start off with, when I started my research sort of largely consisted of me showing the ornithologist a piece of porcelain, going, "Is this a real bird?" and them going, "No." But going back to the red African greys, really interestingly, I went back and looked at 18th century encyclopedias of birds. And at that point, there was quite a bit of confusion about the birds that had this genetic mutation. And in some cases, the bird is described as a separate species. And in other cases, they're like, well, I think it's probably the same kind of bird as this bird, but it just looks slightly different. And they seem to have been prized in the 18th century, these African greys with the red factor. And we know that Sir Hans Sloane, founder of the British Museum, had one because his is described in one of the encyclopedias. And I'm convinced that Madame de Pompadour had one. And I just need to try and find some kind of archival or published reference to the fact that she did. She definitely had a painting of one. There's one on her snuff box. I mean, it's got to be her bird, right?
Any other questions?
Thank you so much, Mia. I have a non-bird question.
What?
Can I? I was thinking about the division of labor and the flower painters in particular.
Mm-hmm.
And for most of your lecture, I was thinking, okay, all of the settings, the branches, the trees, the flowers in particular, are all by Armand because he doesn't really like them that much. He doesn't care. His flowers repeat quite a bit. He just doesn't give them attention. In a way, it makes the birds stand out more.
Yeah.
But then later, with the later pieces, I noticed a renewed or maybe new attention to flowers and foliage in particular.
Yeah.
And I just wondered whether you could speak a little bit more about the settings for the birds and whether it's the flowers and the leaves or whether it's something else, whether you notice other elements.
I think that's very well noticed, Julia. And I think that as his career progresses, I think in the 1770s he starts being more interested in the settings, and I think that possibly. I mean, it's a supposition, but I think it might be to do with like the publication of chinoiserie flowers and plants. I think he's quite influenced by Piedmont and people like Piedmont, and he also seems to enjoy painting flowers much more on hard paste porcelain than he does on soft paste porcelain, and I think that is partly because of the technical differences between the two types of porcelain, and that he's able to use gilding in a different way on the hard paste porcelain to what is possible on soft paste porcelain. So I think that is probably what I would attribute that to, and in the drawings, which are mostly I think from later in his career, the drawings of trees and plants are for the most part kind of spiky, sort of slightly made up chinoiserie trees and plants, and I think he's more interested in those.
Thank you, Mia. That was great. I wonder. So this is largely a project of recovery. You've found this artisan. His name is everywhere. You've found all these wonderful documents. He's all over the archives. To what extent, in his own time, did people recognize his identity, or did they at all? Did it matter? How much of that was? I mean, you've created this whole artistic biography for this person.
Yeah, so I doubt very much that his identity was known by name to any of the customers of Sèvres. I don't think that was sort of in Sèvres. Sèvres wanted the factory name to be what stuck in its customers' minds, rather than the individual artists, which I think possibly was sometimes in conflict with Armand's ego. So I think that he definitely had a good reputation within the factory, and within the people that worked for the factory and the shareholders. But I haven't seen any 18th century references to his name outside of the factory archives, or archives that deal with his like his biography, his birth, death, etc.
I think I heard you use the phrase "his drug-addled brain."
Yeah.
Was he self-medicating?
He was certainly, I think. So he mentions.
I mean, what did he use?
He certainly mentions wine, and he. There are a number of annotations on the back of the drawings where he owes people money for wine. So I think he was definitely fond of a drink or two. Yeah, no, that was a slight license on my part, but it's got to be true.
Any other questions?
Sorry, if I could add just one more point that was particularly interesting to me as an ornithologist who's also written on the history of ornithological illustration. Almond derives from Desportes, Oudry, and other painters who did still lives with a lot of birds interacting. In contemporary with him, ornithological depictions, they're always only a single bird in full profile on a bare branch as a kind of silhouette profile. It wasn't until several decades later that Audubon was the first painter of birds who showed birds interacting in the way that Almond does here. Audubon was doing plates of birds, plates I mean illustrations, not
plates,
ceramic plates that featured a single species for the most part, but he had many, in some cases he had many of the same species interacting in different ways. But he was the very first, and that didn't begin until the 1820s. So for this genre of depictions of birds interacting, Almond was well ahead.
Mm-hmm. And just to kind of bring it sort of slightly full circle, one of the first people that Audubon approached to help fund his amazing publication on the birds of America was, guess who? A Rothschild.
Any other questions? Well, with that, please join me in thanking Mia Jackson.